Okay, thank you, Jenny. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This is, like Jenny said, the first of a two-part webinar on making the Declaration relevant at 250. In this first part, I'm going to give a talk for about 30 minutes or so, and then we can do some Q&A. And then for the second part next week, I'm going to circulate a PDF handout that I've compiled with some primary sources that you can use in the classroom. And basically for the second session, we can just talk about these primary sources, talk about some strategies for teaching the Declaration in ways that can make it meaningful and relevant to students today. So that should be more of a sort of conversation, more of a freewheeling conversation. So I'm looking forward to that. Um, in many ways, the commemorations of anniversaries like this have really become a sort of periodic civic ritual, right? That kind of binds us to previous generations of Americans, but also provides an opportunity for the nation to reflect on not only its past but also its present and its future. And that, I think, is really the opportunity that is provided by 2026. And so I'm going to start by giving a very brief overview of how the colonies came to declare independence and how the Declaration came about, because after all, we're not just commemorating the Declaration in 2026, we're also commemorating independence itself, and independence was a process. But then I want to use the bulk of the remainder of the talk to explore the role of the Declaration in American history, in American politics and culture over the last 250 years, how the way that Americans have understood and interpreted the Declaration has changed over time, and why that's important for teaching the Declaration today. So let's get started. So the Declaration and the declaring of independence was the culmination of a more than decade-long conflict between colonists and Britain. Historians often refer to this as the imperial crisis. After the Seven Years' War ended in 1763, Britain begins to pass legislation aimed at raising revenue from the colonies, but also to consolidate its authority over the colonies. And so after the Stamp Act in 1765 and the Townshend Acts in 1767, both of those really occasioned quite violent protests and economic boycotts. And so both of those acts were repealed. And really by 1773, things had essentially calmed down. But then Parliament passes the Tea Act. And this act, it was an attempt by Parliament to prop up the sort of failing East India Company by giving them a monopoly on the tea that was going to be imported into the colonies. And Bostonians responded, of course, with the famous Boston Tea Party in December of 1773. But there were many tea parties throughout the colonies. Boston was just the first of many. And being so indignant at the destruction of property that occurred during the Boston Tea Party, Parliament in 1774 passes the coercive acts, these sort of infamous coercive acts, which basically shut down local government in Massachusetts and closed Boston Harbor. So, basically cutting Boston off, but cutting the city off, its economy off from the rest of the colonies. And it was really this unprecedented act by Parliament of taking over a colonial government that led the colonists to create the Continental Congress in 1774. And so in 1774, in the fall, the Continental Congress meets for the first time. They spend the fall and the winter of 74 and 75 focused on negotiating a reconciliation with Britain. They're not thinking about independence. But of course, in April of 1775, the fighting breaks out at Lexington and Concord between British regulars and colonial militia. And this really is the beginning of the War for Independence. The War for Independence starts over a year before independence is declared. Even at this point, Congress is not even willing to consider independence as an option. Later that year, later in 75, Congress sends its famous olive branch petition directly to the king, asking him to to intercede in these matters with Parliament. But when the response from the king comes in December in the form of a proclamation calling on all colonists to suppress the rebellion being fomented by the Congress, that's when the door to independence really begins opening. So then in January of 76, there's Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet, Common Sense, is published. And this pamphlet was hugely influential with its critiques not only of Great Britain, but of monarchy itself, which was a first in the sort of resistance movement. Uh, and then all through the remaining sort of winter and spring of 76, the pamphlet circulates throughout the colonies, really convincing more and more colonists that at this point, independence really is the only option. And by May of 1776, this military conflict had been going on for a year, over a year. And it's only then really that Congress finally begins moving toward independence in May of 76. Uh, Most of the elites in Congress had been for reconciliation since it had convened in 1774. And there were many, even in the spring of 76, who still sort of held on to the hope of reconciliation. Uh, but throughout 1775, ordinary colonists really took the lead uh, in 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 pushing the Congress towards independence. And there's a really great book on this topic called American Scripture by Pauline Maier, um, where she uncovers many of what she called local declarations of independence. So um, calls local town and county resolves calling on Congress to declare independence. So, at the beginning of 1775, independence is really unthinkable for almost all British colonists. But over the course of the year, ordinary colonists really start moving toward support for independence, and it takes a lot of time and the pressure that public sentiment built up to eventually bring Congress to sort of catch up with this popular sentiment, and that really happens in May of 1776. Um, Congress passes a resolution basically calling on all of the colonies um, to begin the process of establishing their own state governments to prepare for that prospect. And and so that resolution really um, uh, essentially makes it so that the question surrounding independence becomes now a matter of when, not if. And it's just a few weeks later, on June 7th, that Richard Henry Lee of Virginia proposes the famous Independence Resolution, that the colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown. Um, and expecting that the Congress would eventually pass this resolution, a committee was appointed on June 11th to draft a formal Declaration of Independence. And of course, that committee included Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, all who had been long supporters of independence, but also Robert R. Livingston and Roger Sherman of Connecticut. And of course, Jefferson is chosen to be the one to write the draft. And it's on July 2nd that the Congress meets to vote on the independence resolution. And this is actually from the congressional secretary, Charles Thompson. This is his recording of the independence vote on July 2nd. You can see at the bottom, there's the counting of the votes. There were 12 yeas. There were no nays, and there was one abstention, and the abstention was the delegates from New York, because they had instructions from their provisional assembly that they could not vote for independence. And so they had sent messengers back to their provisional assembly to ask for permission, new instructions that would allow them to vote for independence. But because they were basically preparing to be attacked by the British Army any day, that they were not able to secure those new instructions. And so immediately after this vote on July 2nd, Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration is put to the Congress as a whole, and they debated it for 2 days. And the delegates sort of took turns making edits to the draft, suggesting changes, voting on changes. And it's on July 4th that the document is finally approved by the Congress. Um, and of course, it's read aloud in Philadelphia, sent to a local printer for copies to be circulated as fast as possible. And over the next few weeks, the Declaration slowly made its way out of Philadelphia to Massachusetts and Vermont and New York and New Jersey and Delaware, and then south to Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia. But I think that the question that kind of begs itself from this is, why is a written declaration necessary at all, right? The Congress voted on independence. They voted for independence on July 2nd. So independence is a fact on July 2nd. So why this declaration? Well, in some sense, the answer to that really is in the document's preamble. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands that have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinion of mankind requires that they should declare the causes that impel them to the separation. And so, in other words, the colonies wanted to assume their place among the powers of the earth, right? In other words, to be a recognized nation. And to achieve that recognition meant addressing the opinions of mankind, in other words, the entire world. And so when the committee to draft the Declaration was formed, Congress at the same time also named another committee to draft a call for foreign alliances. And the work of these two committees really was sort of directly intertwined, if you think about it. The Declaration was not a plan of government. It was, in some sense, a PR document, a sort of and a thinly veiled plea for foreign support in the war against the British. The Americans were going to state their rightful case for independence in a declaration in order to convince foreign nations to sign treaties with them and to support their war efforts. And they really needed to make a kind of airtight case because many of the empires that they would be seeking alliances with, namely France and Spain, were monarchies and who were not going to necessarily be inclined to support a Republican rebellion against a king. You can see that nowhere in the Declaration of Independence does Jefferson criticize monarchy itself, like Paine did in Common Sense. Instead, he criticizes George III directly, and so that's my basic 5-minute outline of the process of coming to independence. But what I really want to talk about, and what I think is most relevant for making the Declaration meaningful today, is the sort of afterlife of the Declaration, or how the Declaration became what Pauline Maier called American Scripture. And um, and this is really the core of my most recent book, The Memory of 76. So for 2 decades after independence, the Declaration was not seen as especially important. To most, it symbolized independence and union, and the most important part of it was, in some sense, the grievances, the list of grievances in the middle, not the preamble. The earliest exceptions to this were actually a few African American writers who immediately really grasped the power and the utility of the document's preamble and its statement about equality and liberty much more immediately than white Americans did. This is Lemuel Haynes. He was born in 1753 in Connecticut to a white mother and a black father. And after completing a period of indentured servitude, he became a Minuteman and later participated in the seizure of Fort Ticonderoga with Ethan Allen. And so immediately after the Declaration becomes public knowledge, Haynes begins connecting the Declaration of Independence preamble with the plight of enslaved persons. Is really the first person to do this. In an essay that he wrote in 1776 entitled Liberty Further Extended, he quoted the Declaration statement about equality and rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it seems that he is the first person to quote that line from the Declaration of Independence. And certainly the first to quote it for the purposes that he was quoting it. Haynes pointed out that there were that there was then in these new states greater oppression than that which Englishmen seemed so much to spurn at. And he was talking about an oppression which they themselves impose upon others. Liberty, he wrote, is equally as precious to a black man as it is to a white one, and bondage as equally as intolerable to the one as it is to the other. Now, Haynes later becomes an ordained congregational minister, and he's actually the first African American to preach to a white congregation in the United States. Um, and as I said, he is essentially the first American to quote the preamble of the Declaration and its statement about um, human equality. And so, in some sense, he's the first person to canonize equality as a principle of the revolution, outside of the Declaration itself. And so he begins a process of redefining the Declaration from a document about national independence to one about universal rights. He is the sort of start of that process, and that process really has continued in some sense throughout American history, and that's a lot of what I talk about in the book also. So the document goes from symbolizing independence and union to really beginning to symbolize in the public's mind the ideas of liberty and equality really only in the 1830s. And that's because of the rise of abolitionism. It's really the abolitionist movement that creates what I would call the modern memory of the Declaration as defined by the preamble and the principles of liberty and equality. Abolitionist writers and orators repeatedly mention the Declaration. And here you can see a prominent example. This is the first issue of The Liberator. This is a really important abolitionist newspaper in the 1830s. And William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist, is the publisher, and he's introducing this new abolitionist newspaper here. And he explains the symbolism behind publishing the newspaper in Boston. He says, I determined at every hazard to lift up the standard of emancipation in the eyes of the nation within sight of Bunker Hill and in the birthplace of liberty. He's tying abolitionism to the memory of the revolution, right? And then, this becomes common. Abolitionists meeting in Vermont pass a resolution stating that slavery in 1833 is incompatible with the Declaration of Independence in 1776. In 1839, the Old Colonies Anti-Slavery Society in Plymouth, Massachusetts, resolves that the Declaration was, quote, the fundamental document of our national existence. In other words, the abolitionists defined the Declaration by the principles of equality and liberty, and they defined the revolution as a whole by the Declaration. And that is really important. And it's challenged, right? Southerners respond to this because it becomes so prominent in abolitionist rhetoric. One newspaper in South Carolina in 1835 states that the phrase "all men are created equal" in the Declaration was just, quote, a rhetorical flourish, and claimed that that line was to blame for the wild theories of liberty held by so many, meaning abolitionism. In the hands of abolitionists, Southerners claim that the Declaration became a, quote, very seditious instrument. For Southerners, the Constitution is the fundamental document of the American Revolution. namely because it was their primary tool for protecting slavery, right? Uh, and so what we have is we have these two founding documents, right? These two fundamentally different founding documents, this radical declaration, this rather conservative constitution, um, and abolitionists and pro-slavery Southerners fought over which of these two documents was the defining document of the American Revolution, and which of the principles embedded in them were the defining principles of the revolution. And so, in some sense, abolitionists hoped that the Declaration would save the nation from slavery, while Southerners hoped that the Constitution would save slavery from the Declaration. Uh, in 1852, uh, Frederick Douglass gives his famous July 5th speech in Rochester, New York. And having this event on July 5th was a custom meant to highlight how far the nation was from realizing the ideals of in the Declaration. And in that speech, Douglass he begins by praising the revolution and the founders. He says, "Fellow citizens, I'm not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. The point from which I am compelled to view them is not certainly the most favorable, and yet I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration." But but as he turns his view to the present, his tone turns. He says that the character and conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me than on this 4th of July. Whether we turn to the declarations of the past or the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. And then, of course, the most famous part of this speech where he asks, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July?" It was, he said, "a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham." Uh, Douglass goes on to say that it was, quote, "hollow mockery of the revolution and its ideals for people to celebrate July 4th, to celebrate independence, while ignoring slavery or doing nothing to end slavery, which was clearly um, uh, a rejection of the founding principles in the Declaration of Independence." And what the abolitionists over these years and Douglass really on this day renders so clear was a new way for Americans to relate to the memory of the revolution in the present. And the idea there is that to celebrate the revolution but not do anything about unfreedom and inequality was essentially an insult to the memory of the revolution, and that the real way to honor the memory of the revolution for Douglass and abolitionists was to work toward more actively realizing its most fundamental ideals of liberty and equality. And so for Douglass, the founding may have happened in 1776, but the revolution is still going on, right? Until those ideas are fully realized, the revolution would remain unfinished. And it's this idea of an unfinished revolution that would go on to inspire countless social movements throughout American history who also sought to more fully realize these ideals of liberty and equality for oppressed and marginalized groups. And that too is an important thread in my book, and it's going to be the focus of the packet of readings that I have for the next session. And it is really Abraham Lincoln who essentially canonizes this view of the Declaration as being defined by liberty and equality, and the nation being defined by the Declaration in the Gettysburg Address in 1863. Lincoln told the audience that the Revolution in 1776 had created a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That is, that the new nation was defined by the Declaration, and the Declaration was defined by the way that abolitionists had been talking about it now at this point for decades. Um, and so in Lincoln's mind, really, the Civil War becomes a conflict between or about these two revolutionary principles of liberty and equality, and it becomes about um, uh, 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 protecting and more fully realizing the ideals embedded in the Declaration. Uh, but even before the Civil War, in the 1840s and 1850s, the women's rights movement, which was a sort of forerunner of the suffragist movement, fought for the rights of married women primarily, because in many states, single women could own property, or widowed women. They could sign contracts and receive inheritances, but married women could not. And so in 1851, the Second National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts, declared that, quote, the injustice done to woman as contrary to the principles of humanity and the Declaration of Independence. Um, and these reformers, they also made the argument that the gendered nature of the Declaration's statement about equality, that all men are created equal, was more stylistic than specific. So at this Worcester Convention, one speaker said that anyone who shall contend that men in that memorable document does not stand for the human race would charge them with gross dishonesty or ignorance. It was inconceivable um, that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are the inalienable rights of only half of the human species. The convention passed a resolution saying they argued that property owning women were being subjected to taxation without representation because their property could be taxed, but they could not vote. And at an 1853 Women's Rights Convention in New York, uh, one resolution asked, is it not a principle of American law that no human being ought to be held responsible for a law to which that human being has not consented? Was that not the very principle of our revolution? So you can see that they're drawing on the revolution to make their case for women's rights. And really the most famous expression of that comes in 1848 in the famous Declaration of Sentiments from Seneca Falls. There is an excerpt of this in the packet for next week. And basically, the Declaration of Sentiments essentially reproduces the Declaration of Independence in its form and in much of its language, but it changes the preamble to include women. Right? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. And then they also substitute the list of grievances with their own list of grievances, and that included overly restrictive divorce laws, the inability of women to work for themselves, and uh, uh, the uh, the imposition of sort of more stringent moral standards on women. Um, and in the late 19th century, the National Women's Suffrage Association takes this further, of course, and they really use the centennial anniversary of independence in 1876 quite effectively. The leaders of the movement had petitioned the commission running the celebration in Philadelphia on July 4th for a place in the program of the main event in front of Independence Hall. But of course, that all-male commission refused. But they did give them tickets for a few seats in the reserve section. And so the leaders of the NWSA, including Susan B. Anthony, uh, decided that they were going to take advantage of this moment. And so they waited until the Declaration had been read from the podium. And then in the sort of in the sort of temporary hubbub between speakers, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton walked up to the dais and began handing out printed copies of their Declaration of Rights. And this really caused quite a stir. And as they were removed from the dais, they made their way to a side stage, handing out more copies of their Declaration of Rights. And people were quite interested in what all the commotion was about. And it was from this small stage that Anthony read their Declaration of Rights to the women of the United States. And, echoing the language of the Declaration, the history of our country, the past 100 years, has been a series of assumptions and usurpations of power over woman in direct opposition to the principles of just government acknowledged by the United States at its foundation. And so they made the case to the public that that denying female suffrage was to deny the principles of the revolution, of the Declaration. And they're drawing on this idea of the unfinished revolution, right? That really goes back to the abolitionists and to Frederick Douglass. And this is the idea that you honor the revolution by working toward more fully realizing its principles. Now, in the mid 20th century, the civil rights movement also drew heavily on the Declaration and this idea of the unfinished revolution. When Martin Luther King is jailed in Birmingham, he writes his famous letter from the jail. He was responding to claims that he was an extremist, and he writes, was Jesus an extremist for love? And it was Thomas Jefferson. And then he quotes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." He reminded his readers that African Americans had been, contributors to the nation even before the revolution and were therefore sort of equal inheritors of its legacy, right? Before the pen of Jefferson, he wrote, etched the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence across the pages of history. We were here. And yet he spoke of the great wells of democracy that were dug deep by the founding fathers in the Declaration of Independence. And when King spoke at the March on Washington in 1963, which you can see in the image here, he argued that the Declaration was a promissory note to every American. It was a promise that all men would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so he too is drawing on this idea of an unfinished revolution, and it puts him and the civil rights movement within this long chain of and this long tradition of social movements using the Declaration of Independence and redefining the terms of the Declaration of Independence. Even at the bicentennial of 1976, the uh, the women's movement, the civil rights movement by gays and lesbians all used the Declaration and used this language of an unfinished revolution. On July 4th, 1976, Karen DeCrow, who is the president of NOW, reread the speech that Susan B. Anthony had disrupted the celebration at the 1876 centennial. At a rally in East Los Angeles, a member of the Peace and Freedom Party, Jan Tucker, told a reporter, "We have to raise this issue this year that the American Revolution didn't just stop in 1776. It's still going on," she said. In the early 1960s, the Mattachine Society, which was a pioneering gay rights organization, declared that its goal was to, quote, secure for the homosexual the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as proclaimed for all men by the Declaration of Independence. In 1965, they held a public protest in front of Independence Hall, where the Declaration was passed, just like civil rights movement groups like CORE had done in recent years. Pride parades in New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco in 1976 all featured Spirit of 76 banners and floats with people dressed up in sort of 18th century costumes. And basically, the bicentennial provided these new movements for civil rights to express not just their desire for equal rights before the law, but really their right to belonging in the nation, right? A major part of cultural citizenship for Americans is to be able to lay claim to the legacy of the revolution, of the nation's founding. And one of the ways that groups have been denied citizenship in a cultural sense has been to reject their claims to the legacy of the revolution. And so basically, I've hoped to give you a little background on the history of the Declaration, but also this sense of its afterlife. None of the founders could have predicted that this document would become a sort of aspirational symbol for succeeding generations of Americans trying to right the nation's wrongs and cure its ills. And the ideals in the Declaration really make it possible for the emergence of this idea of the unfinished revolution, which I would actually argue has been one of the most powerful ideas in American history, because it has helped inspire and serve as a tool for many of our most important and successful social movements. The memory of the revolution and the Declaration itself has really provided us with a sort of shared political language, right? That we've used to express our concerns and dissatisfactions with the present, and also our visions of the future. And no text has been more key in shaping that political language than the Declaration. And it's reinforced in our civic identity, a sense of sort of aspiration and idealism, and a belief and a commitment to progress for many, though of course not all Americans. Um, and So this idea of the unfinished revolution and this long history of how the Declaration has been used by the marginalized and the powerless, I think is really critical if we want to shape a commemoration for the 250th, or to teach the revolution and the Declaration around the 250th. I actually think that it's way more important for students to learn the history of how the Declaration has been used throughout American history than it is for them to learn about, the history of the Declaration itself. And part of that is because, we can see that, Americans of of almost each generation really have made the Declaration their own. They have redefined the terms of the Declaration. They've redefined what liberty meant. They've redefined the meaning of equality. Um, and it really beckons us to do the same, right? Um, I think the great lesson of this is that the Declaration is not just a static document from 1776, entombed in a airtight glass case in the National Archives. It's a living, breathing platform for change. It's a tool for civic engagement and for inspiring discussions about these ideals, about liberty and equality and independence. And it provides an opportunity for every generation of Americans to decide what those ideals mean to them in their present, in their own context. And so, in some sense, I mean, Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, Martin Luther King, and the countless many other ordinary Americans whose names will never be remembered, really, in some sense, have just as much of a claim to being thought of as authors of the Declaration of Independence as Thomas Jefferson. And so I think that, I really think the best way to teach the Declaration in 2026 is actually not to focus on the stuff from the beginning of the talk, but is instead, um, uh, I think it's even more important for students to learn some of this history of the Declaration's afterlife, of how it's been used by marginalized groups and how it's been redefined by oppressed groups to lay their claims to citizenship and belonging in the nation, and to redefining these ideals of liberty and equality. And that's because once students realize that the Declaration has been constantly reinterpreted according to the present, that they should then realize that they can reinterpret it according to their own present, according to their own perspectives, their own needs, their own beliefs. And that's going to be the sort of focus of our discussion in the second session of this webinar.